I'm going to go to Dele Ogun before we go to the Q&A session. But please, Dele, the floor is yours. War and peace in Yoruba land, new perspectives. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. So those who are not haven't got the cameras on, you may struggle to follow my presentation. I'm speaking on war and peace in Yoruba land, new perspectives. Where's this new perspective coming from? It's coming from our understanding in recent times of war, the explanation for wars, and the real reason for war. The Iraq War. We were told that it was weapons of mass destruction, were we not? But then it then turned out that there were no weapons of mass destruction. So that should tell us that there is a difference between the explanations that are often given for war and the real reason for the war. Those of us who studied history abroad were told that the First World War, that the reason for the war, the cause of the war, was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo. And that is what led to the catalyst that now sets off the First World War, into which everybody else was drawn. Bringing it back home, we heard our first speaker, Sheyi, this morning, give us an excellent narrative on the Kiriji War. And he said that the war was an economic war. It was, the spark for it was the need to collect taxes. And in the process of that tax collection, an insult was given to Fagoyi, which then led to the conflagration. I'm going to share with you a new perspective on the Kiriji War. And I start by sharing with you the state of Yoruba land in 1820s. This is the words of Hugh Clapperton, who we were told was an explorer, but those of us who studied the history now know that these were just part of the intelligence agents that were roaming our land, doing the reconnaissance ahead of the plan for colonization. And see what he said. I cannot omit bearing testimony to the singular and perhaps unprecedented fact that we have already traveled 60 miles in 80 days with numerous and heavy baggage and about 10 different relays of carriers without losing so much as the value of a shilling, public or private. A circumstance evincing not only somewhat more than common honesty in the inhabitants, but a degree of subordination and regular governments which could not have been supposed to exist amongst the people hitherto considered barbarians. That was Hugh Clapperton. You see, we were told that we were barbarians. That was the narrative that they were running, that we were always killing ourselves. But see the evidence, a peaceful land, an honest land. But let's roll forward. I take this, the other narrative that has been run about us is that the Yoruba are, how do they say it? They are cowards. That's why we have no presence in the army. But look at this. This is from a book, Robert S. Smith, The Kingdoms of the Yoruba, And this is what he wrote, that the power of the Oyo continue to impress their neighbors is confirmed by what Robert Norris heard of them in Dahomey. And this is what he heard. The Dahomians may possibly exaggerate, but he's written Ayors, that is the Oyors, are certainly a very populous, warlike, and powerful nation. Now, let me take you through a very brief chronology of how Ibadan emerged as a military state and focus on the international dimension. So in 1807, we have the abolition of the slave trade. That was the act passed by the English Parliament to bring a trade that had been scouring our lands for 400 years, to bring it to an end. What happens next? Colonization of Sierra Leone. Now, students of history would appreciate the connection between Sierra Leone and the construction of Nigeria. This is where the Ajayi Crowthers came from. This is where the James, I've forgotten his middle name now, Payne, all came from. That was their training camp for those who had been so-called rescued from the slave trade. That was the place where they learnt our language, and in return, some of our returnees were schooled in their language. With what objective? With an eye on penetration, as you see as we move forward. 1817 was the Owu attack on Ife, which led to the siege of Owu land by the Oyo and the Ijebu in combination. The Egba sided with the Owu people, and both in consequence were destroyed. And the Allied army, the Ibadan army, now settled in what we now know as Ibadan. This was the former homeland of the Egba people. That was 1821. That was the origin and the seed of the repositioning of the Egba people in Abeokuta area, which you would know, those students of history would know, that that became an important space for Christian missionary activities. 1830 was the Afonja episode in Ilorin, which the Fulani took advantage of to take that part of our land. 1840 is when the Fulani were defeated by the Ibadan army at Oshogbo. So that is a short narrative that then tells us the picture of Ibadan as at 1840. And this is taken from not an Oyo man, it is taken from an Ekiti man. And those who understand the sides that were taken in the Kiriji War, which is Oyo and his allies against Ekiti, Parapo, i.e. Ekiti and his allies. So this is an Ekiti man, a professor of history, one of our leaders. In his book, Revolution and Power Politics, he said this: by the 1840s, Ibadan had evolved into an essentially military state. Qualification for chieftaincy title was usually decided by military prowess, not the rice and chicken plenty that we now use to determine who should be chief and who should be not. Chieftaincy titles were not hereditary. Any man, regardless of his place of origin or his birth, could become a chief if he showed the requisite military capabilities and could rise by promotion to the leadership of the Ibadan state. Many adventurous men from all over Yoruba land migrated to Ibadan, there to seek the military honors which they could not hope to achieve in their own places of origin. So it was not just the people of Ibadan that were acquiring this military expertise. It was permeating across the country as people were sending their young people into the army. And then, of course, when we now wind forward to the construction of the Nigerian army, people were telling us that for some reason, people did not want to go into the army because they were cowards. But look at the history. So again, we return to Professor Akintoye for this insight. He said, under the impact of Ibadan, the traditional military organization of the Ekiti and the Ijesha had gradually undergone a change. There was imitation. We were always a people who love excellence. So when we saw, and other parts of Yoruba land saw, the excellence of the Ibadan warriors, there was a natural inclination to imitate them. So the Ibadan military titles of Balogun, Otun, Osi, and Seriki, etc., made their appearance. The new system placed emphasis upon merit and made it possible to invest in new capable warriors with the responsibility of defense. So that was the picture. On the one side, Ibadan, with its acclaimed military excellence, and on the other side, Ekiti, that had learnt the lessons, often directly from Ibadan itself. And people say we do not have a martial history. Well, let's look at the chronology again. The timeline to Kiriji War and Peace. 1833, abolition of slavery. Let me emphasize the distinction between abolition of the slave trade, which was 1807, but slavery continued, and slavery itself was not abolished, at least by law, until 1833. On the back of that abolition exercise is when, in 1841, look at the timeline, 1841 was the Niger expedition. What was this about? This was when they were now looking to move into our lands, into the hinterland, because the naval patrols for abolition of the slave trade was, of course, on the coast. But now this was the move in, led by or assisted by the Sierra Leone contingents. 1845, this is the countdown to conflict in our land. 1845, Kosoko dethrones King Akintoye of Lagos. 1846 was the beginning of the Abeokuta CMS mission. And look at what then happens next. With that base in Abeokuta, power can now be projected to the bombardment of Lagos in 1851. 1860 is the war between Ibadan and Ijaye. 1861 is the formal colonization of Lagos. This is when the British move into Lagos and take that offshore base. Then we then have the beginning of the Kiriji War in 1870, and the war, 16 years, as you have heard, rolls on until 1886. Now, you've heard it said that was arguably the longest civil war on record. 16 years of slaughter amongst our people. But where was the weaponry coming from? These are the questions we must ask ourselves. What set me off on this line of inquiry, looking for the external influence in this war, was a passage that I read in Samuel Johnson's History of the Yoruba, where he said that one of our great military commanders, Ogumola, he died from not a bullet, not a machete, not a spear. He died from a blanket that was infected with smallpox. That immediately set my mind thinking about the smallpox and blankets that were used to kill off the Native American Indians in America. Then, of course, there was the Sniper rifles, very sophisticated weaponry that was being poured into this conflict. So I could see that foreign hands were changing the balance of power within Yoruba land, clearly with the object of colonization. Why do I say that? Here's the context. Yoruba land could never have been conquered by direct assault by the British or any other colonizing force because of the vegetation and afforestation. The British had been defeated in Haiti in 1794, 1795. Toussaint Louverture, a slave army, had defeated them. The vegetation and the environment and the geography was very, very similar, with the malaria factor in particular. So from that experience, there was no way that they were going to fight their way into our land with a view to colonizing us. It had to be done by proxy wars. So when you look at the experience of other places, the picture then begins to form. Here's a passage from Professor Akintoye again. Far away in Lagos, returned emigres from Sierra Leone and the Americas, who were of Ekiti and Ijesha origins, and a number of Ijesha Ekiti men who, although captured and sold from their homes, had been fortunate enough to avoid being shipped away from Lagos, had formed themselves into an association called the Ijesha Association as early as about 1852. They appear to have, by 1876, changed the name of their association to the Ekiti Parapor Society. It began in Lagos as a Christian group, holding weekly prayer meetings. So, as I said, the Sierra Leone factor, the returnees, what Professor Akintoye has called the emigres, a critical part of understanding the international dimension to what we thought was a civil war arising from an insult that had been inflicted by one party on the other. We're not unique. We're not unique in the experience of colonization. And when we seek to understand what happened in our own space, we must look abroad, look at the lessons of China, the process by which China was colonized by the European powers. Again, internal conflicts, proxy wars. Let's look at India. Those of students of history will understand how the East India Company, from its arrival off the coast of India, this narrative that then followed was one of conflict and civil war right across India. What about the Native American Indians? You remember all the wars between the various Indian tribal groups? What was that about, and how did it end? It all ended in colonization. And then, of course, we must never forget the Berlin Conference of 1884. Kiriji War was going on, At the time, they were sat in Berlin deciding how the place was going to be carved up between themselves. And remember the criteria that was applied in deciding who would get what, which part, which slice of the land or the continent will go to who. They had to demonstrate what is called effective occupation. You're not going to demonstrate effective occupation in 1884 by simply remaining in Lagos. You're going to have to demonstrate that you have presence in the mainland. So this is the important context to this Kiriji War, that we must. My only purpose here is just to tease the issues, but we must research, study, reflect on this much more critically. Because when we understand the true reasons for conflict between us, we will then get a better understanding of how we will build unity amongst us going forward. And so I look forward, I'll end it there. I could write a book on this issue, but time does not allow. I look forward to the question and answer session.